Sorry, everybody. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I am the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Tuesday, December 15th, and we will hear the presentation, Equity by Design. For your content questions related to the presentation, you can type those in the questions box located in your GoToWebinar tool panel, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. If you have technical questions, you can also type those in the chat box, and I'll do my best to try to answer those for you. Coming up next on your screen is can everyone see my screen? All of a sudden it looks like, can you see my screen, Elisa and Sarah?
Not yet.
No?
Not yet.
I don't know why. Hold on one second. Let's see here. Let me try this. All of a sudden it looks like, here we go. Now you can see my screen?
Yep. Yes.
All right. So here's a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2020. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today we're sponsored by a newer member of our consortium, and we're happy to have them. We're sponsored by an organization called SKEO, which you'll learn a little bit more during their intro. So thanks to you all for joining us this year, and we hope that you'll join us again in the future. This was a great collaboration. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our upcoming webcasts. This is it for 2020. It's today, tomorrow, Thursday, and Friday. So we have a lot of great webcasts here for the remainder of 2020, and we're already booking into 2021. So be sure to check out our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast, to register for all of our upcoming sessions. Today's session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing, and you can record those AICP CM credits by heading over to planning.org and logging into your MyAPA account. And from there, you can search either by today's title or event number, both of which, again, can be found on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And be sure to like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series. Just search Planning Webcast Series and we'll pop up. That's where we post any important information like time changes, date changes, when there's new sessions available to register for. So be sure to like us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Again, just search Planning Webcast Series and we'll pop up. We record all of our sessions and we post them on our YouTube channel. So if you subscribe, then you'll get information when new sessions are available for you to view. We have over 300 sessions, so be sure to head over there. That's it for my housekeeping items. We do have some polling questions, so just a heads up, make sure you're paying attention so that you can participate during throughout our polling questions, and be sure to type those questions into the chat box as you have them, and we will answer those, like I said, at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. So with that, I am going to turn the controls over to Elisa, who will kick us off. Those controls are over to you, and you are good to go. Perfect.
Great. Well, greetings, everyone. Sarah and I are excited to be with you all today. So let's get started with introductions. Sarah, do you want to go first?
Sure. I'll just share a little bit first about the firm that Elisa and I work for, and then a little bit about my own personal background. Elisa and I work for a planning and design firm located in Charlottesville, Virginia, called SKEO Solutions. We do a lot of work at the intersection of equity and the environment. So our projects tend to focus on issues of equitable development, helping communities overcome places where they may be stuck around conflicts related to race, class, underinvestment, disinvestment. And we also do a lot of work in the watershed design space, as well as equitable community engagement, which we're here to talk about today, and site reuse and planning in communities that either have brownfield or Superfund sites. So that's a little bit about our firm. I have worked at SKEO for the last 11 years, and my background is in community development and community engagement. I do a lot of work in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, and I'm really excited to share about some of the communities that Elisa and I have worked in as we go through the webinar today. Elisa, I'll pass it back to you.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So again, Elisa Heffner, and I've been with SKEO for almost 16 years, and my background is in landscape architecture, and have been working similarly with Sarah with communities really across the country. And one of the things I focus on, in addition to community revitalization and designing, authentic community engagement processes, is also in the realm of watershed planning and resiliency planning with communities, particularly those that have been impacted by natural disasters. So I think between Sarah and I both, we've have been able to work with a lot of different communities and a lot of different situations. And as Sarah mentioned, we are excited to be able to share those with you today.
So I'll share a little bit about our learning objectives, and then we'll jump into the presentation. We want to cover with you some terms and concepts related to equitable development and how equitable development goals can shape your community engagement. Then we'll explore some principles for relationship development with underserved communities or underrepresented communities, and how those relationships can focus on centering and elevating community voices in the planning process and outcomes. And then finally, we'll take a look at some strategies for conducting equitable community engagement over the life cycle of projects. So we're going to start out with a poll, and as the polling question is being pulled up, we just want to hear from folks who are with us. Are you aware of planning projects that did not achieve full potential because the community wasn't meaningfully involved? Yes or no?
Folks, you should see that question popping up now on your screen. I'll give you a few seconds and then we'll close it and show those results. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close that, and we'll share the results. So it looks like 88% of our respondents said yes, you are aware of planning projects that didn't achieve full potential, and 12% said no. So I'm going to go ahead and give those controls back to you, Elisa.
Okay, great.
Great. Okay, thanks everyone. All right, so let's go to the next slide. So thanks for sharing those experiences, and we'll have a few more polling questions throughout the presentation to start to get a sense of the diversity of those experiences that you guys have had with community engagement. But to start, let's get into equitable development. Next slide. So why do disparities exist today? I think as planners, most of us are pretty familiar with this, but just to summarize, I think, present day disparities and inequities come from several different causes and are complex and unique to the situations in which they evolve. But broadly speaking, they tend to be the result of public policy decisions. And some of those public policy decisions may have been intentionally discriminatory and to have targeted specific groups of low-income communities, people of color, tribal, or immigrant communities. Other public policies may have been neutral or benignly intentioned initiatives, but have had unintended impacts, whether they positively impacted some communities, negatively impacted others. And so I think the hopeful thing to recognize is that if we know that our public policy decisions have contributed to some of the disparities facing us today in the US, we also know that public policy can be a part of the solution. When we understand how we got to where we are, we can look ahead to where we want to go. Next slide. So just a few slide terms to begin to talk about some of the disparities that have been lifted up this year in particular relative to racism and anti-racism, and how we can talk about that in planning and policy work. These terms are taken from Ibram Kendi's excellent book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which I would highly recommend for everybody in the planning profession. But just to kind of go through how he breaks down talking about racism and anti-racism, he first starts with the term racial inequity. And it defines that as when two or more racial groups are not standing on approximately equal footing. So pretty simple decision there. Racial inequity when two or more racial groups are not standing on approximately equal footing. Racist policy. Any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity between two racial groups, two or more. So again, just drawing a connection there between the inequities as we see them today in our communities and the policies that led us to this point. Then he moves into thinking about what underpins those policies and defines racist ideas as any idea that suggests one racial group is inferior to another racial group in any way. And so then with those, with that collection of definitions, we can then look at the difference between racism and anti-racism. Racism would be a powerful collection of racist policies that lead to racial inequity and are substantiated by racist ideas. So bringing all of those together, he defines racism and takes it out of the interpersonal space where I think a lot of us get stuck because racism and racist can be really charged words that can kind of shut conversations down. And he starts to say, it's not about intent, it's about impact. The idea is that there are these policies and their impact is that they lead to racial inequity. And so then the reverse obviously can also be true. Anti-racism would be a powerful collection of anti-racist policies that lead to racial equity and are substantiated by anti-racist ideas. And that's what we want to get into as we think about community engagement in our conversation today. We want to kind of have this framing around inequity in general, and then given the year that we've just had and the way in which racial inequities have been elevated in the conversation, we want to kind of have that context of thinking about how can equitable community engagement help us move our public policy and our planning efforts towards an anti-racist stance that moves us back towards equity. Next slide. Okay, so what then is equity? Dictionary definition, improving equity is to promote justice, impartiality, and fairness within the procedures, processes, and distribution of resources and rewards by institutions or systems. So again, coming back to policies and institutions and systems. Tackling equity issues requires that understanding of the underlying or root causes of disparities within our society. Next slide. This is a great graphic that I love to use. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation created it, and if it's helpful to you in your work, they have it available for free on their website and are very supportive of folks using it. But I think it's a really great illustration that helps us move from that dictionary definition of equity to really understanding what equity means and looks like. It's easy, I think, in a lot of conversations to confuse equality and equity. But as you look at the difference between these two images, you may begin to notice that equality is where each person is receiving the exact same thing, and it doesn't always fit what their needs are. Whereas equity is describing a situation where each person is receiving what they need. So in this instance, you can see that the bikes that are being given in the top graphic really only work for one person, even though everyone is receiving equal resources. Only one person is really able to use that bike. Whereas in the equity scenario below, each person receives something that they can use, and folks can all go on a bike ride together. Next slide. So bottom lining it, equity is about making sure that everyone has everything they need to thrive. Next slide. Okay, equitable development. Equitable development is a framework and planning that ensures that current residents in communities that have experienced inequities are going to benefit from development and have a meaningful role in the planning process. So notice it's about two things. First, it's about outcomes, making sure that folks who currently live in a community benefit as the community changes and revitalizes. And number two, it's about process. It's about making sure that their voices are actually guiding those changes and helping to inform the goals and outcomes. Next slide. So just to do a quick recap, our public policies have created inequitable outcomes and living conditions for some communities. using that equitable development approach acknowledges the root causes of inequitable development, and equitable development ensures that current residents can benefit from development with improved living conditions and quality of life. And number two, have a meaningful role in the planning process, which lets them influence the outcomes and decisions that affect their own communities. Next slide.
Great. So this next section is going to focus on the importance of building those productive community relationships and introduces some tools and approaches that we found helpful in our work. So to get us started, we're going to have another poll question. And so while that's coming up, the question will be, have you ever had challenges engaging with a community different from your own culture on a project? Great, looks like that's up. So this is another, please select one, yes or no. We haven't really talked about culture in this presentation yet, but you know, culture can mean a lot of different things. And so as you're thinking about that, thinking about a project where maybe you were working in a community that was different from your own culture. Maybe you grew up in, say, a rural setting and you're working in an urban community. So really, you can think sort of broadly about this. We'll give folks just another second. Okay. Great. So about the same sort of distribution here, with the majority of you have had challenges in working with a community that was different from your own culture. So let's go ahead to our next polling question. Thinking about that, I'm going to just give us a second here to get that next polling question up. So thinking about that, particularly for those who have selected yes, what have been those barriers? So here you can check all that apply. So maybe it was limited community participation in those planning efforts. Maybe it was sort of a check the box approach to community engagement, and maybe that approach was driven by your client. It could be those cultural differences, maybe a history of distrust, or meetings characterized by anger or misunderstanding, or a lack of community understanding on the technical issues. And maybe it was something else. And if you would have selected other as part of what those barriers are, feel free to chat those into your dialog box there, because we can come back to that during the Q&A.
Just in parentheses, put poll or something, just so that I know that that's what we're talking about, so that I can collect them together.
Great. So I'll give folks just another second to think about what those barriers have been, check all that apply, and if it's something else, chat those to us with poll in parentheses. Okay, it's like I'm gonna have to get really close to my screen to see the poll results. So it looks like the top two, or the top contenders here, were limited community participation and planning efforts. Definitely familiar with that. And community distrust. And then the third choice there was a lack of community understanding of the technical issues. Great. So this is barriers that we've experienced as well, and can talk about those in more detail as we go into this next section of the presentation. So I think it's going to come back to me to share my screen. Okay. Great. So in terms of building productive relationships, we find that meaningful community engagement works best when we are not talking at folks in that sort of one-way engagement, but rather building their capacity and their power and their ability to build collaborative partnerships. So you can see here in this diagram of moving from one-way communication, where you're just talking at people, to really empowering the community to our ultimate goal of those community, collaborative community partnerships. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail as we move forward. So here are some of those approaches for building those community relationships. First is starting a new conversation, and begin by those conversations by acknowledging the elephant in the room. As Sarah was mentioning in talking about sort of how we got to where we are with some of our public policy, in a lot of the communities that we work with, there is that elephant in the room, and it could be planning fatigue, it could be historic conflicts or distrust among the community in the city, it could be cultural differences or present day inequities. And so one example here, and that's what this photo is from, is a project that we worked on in Raleigh, North Carolina. It was a park planning project, and the elephant in the room for this project was that the park that was being redesigned was born out of racial segregation. The park was built during the Jim Crow era as the colored park, meant to be used only by Black people. And so by acknowledging the elephant in the room right up front in that planning process, really helped get the project off on a well, and by acknowledging that elephant in the room and the history of this park, and being able to open up dialogue. So that's the first approach that we've wanted to share. The next is listening to community needs, and this is talking about designing an open and inclusive meeting, asking many questions, and listening to the responses. I think we've often found ourselves where in a planning process where you go into a community where the plan or the framework for the plan has already been decided upon, and there wasn't really this opportunity to engage the community on what they think, but rather telling them what sort of has already been decided. And so I think this is an interesting opportunity to think about your planning processes in terms of including the community in even how the process is being designed. And so an opportunity to allow communities to share about neighborhood issues that may seem unrelated to the project, making space to hear those different ideas or topics that may not be related to your specific planning project. And then affirm the conditions that are often unique to a particular place, history, and experience. So again, listening, not being eager to respond or rebut what a community member is saying, but really creating that space to hear community needs. I think this is just so critical for building trust and new relationships within the community that you're working in. And related to building trust is, one thing is to ask for and incorporate feedback. And then provide opportunities to impact decision making. And these can be big and small, and Sarah's going to talk about this in more detail. But anything from the best time for a meeting to really engaged community members that are really helping make decisions along the way. And related to that, being upfront about decisions that have already been made. I think this is one of a pitfall of it can be a pitfall for planning projects when folks are not clear about the role that the community has in decisions or what decisions have already been made. And it's very often that there are decisions that have already been made or things that are off the table for different consideration, for different reasons. Also learning about the community's dynamics and the history. This also gets back to being able to identify the elephant in the room and being able to address that up front. Seeking out tools that address differences and build capacity for productive engagement. There are a lot of different tools that we use with communities that we've worked with, whether it's capacity building training, collaborative problem solving techniques, maybe it's a need for maybe cultural humility in order to be able to bring folks together and be able to address productively some of the differences that may be preventing sort of productive dialogue. And then finally, building those authentic personal relationships is so critical to building trust. And again, you'll see we came back there at the end, ask for feedback. That's a really key way to really build trust with the community and partners that you're working with. And related to partnership strategies, building relationships and partnerships with trusted community leaders and institutions is really critical for building those productive relationships. We also find enlisting groups with either like ethnic, civic, or cultural affiliation within the neighborhood can really be an effective strategy for building partnerships. And also recognizing that community-based organizations can be good resources for conducting outreach and education within the community. They have the relationships and the trust and can really be great partners on your planning project. And then also consider how your project might build new relationships between those community-based partners and the resource partners. Particularly in underserved communities, there can be this history of not feeling like you have a place at the table or not being included in decisions that impact your community. And as planners, we often have this role of conveners and connectors and can help connect communities with those resource partners. And I think that's really another important tool for building partnerships and building trust within the community. I think related to that, I'll turn it over to Sarah to just provide us an example here.
Sure. So Elisa talked about building partnerships with communities, and I think one thing that we should be looking for as we enter communities, whether we work for local government or consulting firms helping local governments or other contexts, we should be looking for who are those trusted partners in the community who already have those relationships, and how can we introduce ourselves and the project to them and ask them, is this something you think your community would want to participate in? Here are the opportunities to make change and for their voices to actually impact outcomes. And would this be a valuable use of residents' time? So one of the recent projects that SKEO worked on was called Voices for Vulnerable Populations. It was a partnership taking place in Alameda County, and among the many headlines of 2020, I think are the wildfire smoke headlines coming out of the West and certainly out of the Bay Area in California. And so in this instance, the Public Health Department of Alameda County was looking to conduct some outreach to hear directly from vulnerable populations in the community about how they best receive information relative to wildfire smoke events. What did they need to know, and what was the best way for them to receive that information, to know that it would be factually accurate, that they could trust it, and that they were receiving it in a timely way. The county already had in place an alert system, a text message alert system called AC Alerts that folks could sign up for, but they realized that it was not reaching into many of the populations that were particularly vulnerable to wildfire smoke. And so we worked with them to prioritize and think about who are those populations that tended to be missing from their primary vehicles of communication, and how could we reach out and help them find some community partners who could assist with gathering that information from the residents directly. So in that process, we found 3 community groups that would help reach out to the Latino community, to the unhoused community, and to day laborers. And so you'll see the names of those organizations listed on the screen, and they ended up being very instrumental in helping us think about how can we design an effective conversation for each community so that we're gathering the same information. There's some consistency in what we're asking across all 3 conversations, but we're asking the questions in a way that relate to the context of each specific community. I think that's another key takeaway, is to remember that the community doesn't exist. There are many communities, within your community, and so beginning to be specific about which community are we trying to address and who's that partner who can really help us set up a conversation that is meaningful to those residents is important. And we'll come back to this case study in a few minutes, and I'll add a few more details. But I think I'll leave it there for now, Lisa.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So just to recap this portion of our presentation. So first, identifying and acknowledging the elephant in the room. particularly when there is distrust between the community and local decision makers. Sometimes this can feel uncomfortable, but so critical in terms of addressing inequity and and building sort of trust with the community that you're working with. And then again, building productive community relationships really depends on believing that their residents' thoughts, their feelings, and expertise are vital to your work. I feel like we often, in a planning project, will talk about sort of technical experts who bring, whether it's engineering or historic preservation, as technical experts as part of the process. But we also recognize that community members are community experts and recognize them in the process as well as in terms of experts, because no one knows their community better than the people who live there, and acknowledging that expertise is also vital for building that productive relationship. And then building those community partnerships that open doors and increase trust, just as Sarah was mentioning in that Alameda example. And then really seeking opportunities to acknowledge and respond to community needs throughout the process. Sarah, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. So in our next section, we're going to get into some more specific tools for conducting equitable engagement. Go to the next slide. All right, so this should look really familiar, I hope, to a lot of planners. And so I'll just cover it very briefly. Elisa had showed us a very simplified version of the spectrum earlier with the slide moving from one-way engagement to collaborative community partnerships. And the IEP2 spectrum of public participation is just a more advanced kind of specific way of thinking about that. But one thing we like to work on in the communities where we do equitable planning projects is to really break down the whole process of a project from start to finish, and think about what are the outcomes we're looking for, and what are the different phases of work that are going to lead us to those outcomes. And so being able then to connect this spectrum of public participation to different phases in the process really helps us think about how can we do that community engagement at each phase of the process in a way that is clear, in a way that is transparent, and where community members know at each point in their engagement, when they're investing their time, what level of influence will their time and their expertise have over project outcomes. What's feasible, if there's something that's off the table, just being super honest about that from the get-go, but also then pointing to where community members' recommendations will impact outcomes so that they are clear, and recognizing that it may be different at different stages of work. Sometimes at the beginning of process, you really are just in that inform phase of letting folks know what's going on and where the decision-making moments will be in the process and how they can be engaged, and then you can move into consult, involve, collaborate, and even empower at later phases in the project. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so let's talk about some communication strategies that can be helpful with community engagement. First, do your research. Understand the demographics of the community in the project study area and understand the historic context. Elisa talked about this a little bit earlier, but coming in and knowing something about the community can help build trust. Understand and address the needs, priorities, and interests of the community. This is really critical because a lot of times when we're doing a project, we're on mission. There's a specific goal that project is trying to address, and it can be tempting to try to just be as efficient as possible with making sure conversations kind of stick within the expected bounds of that meeting that particular goal. But there's an advantage and a real way to elevate a project's outcomes by allowing moments for the conversation to open up and to really just understand and address the needs, priorities, and interests of the community. It's those moments where when community members are raising issues that may at first seem to have very little to do with the project at hand, where you can have those aha moments and those insights about how the project and the resources that are being put behind it can really be leveraged to meet and address the needs of the community and build that buy-in and ultimately those benefits for the community that already exists. Use modes of communication that are familiar and effective, and do that when possible in collaboration with community leaders and institutions. Especially in instances where trust doesn't exist, it can be really important to piggyback on and collaborate with those folks that are already trusted in the community to make sure the message comes across in a way that can be heard. Use language the community can easily relate to and understand. That means thinking through what acronyms we're using, and it can also mean doing some capacity building around technical terms that may be essential to the process so that folks feel empowered, they're learning something as they go, and they can enter into a space and speak confidently. At other times, it means recognizing that there may be some language that we use as planners that's really not necessary in a community space, that really doesn't translate well. And so being strategic and thinking about what language is important to the conversation, are there some capacities we need to build around that language, and what language really may not be important to the conversation. How can we rephrase things in plain language, easy to understand ways? And then finally, connect public involvement directly to decision-making and community needs. If you're asking someone to invest their time, to give up an evening, to give up an afternoon that they could have spent with family and friends, they need to know why, and they need to know what the outcomes will be. Next slide. All right, so some additional engagement strategies, working with community leaders to identify appropriate meeting times and locations, or visiting existing meetings. If there are community groups that already have events going on, making sure that you consider opportunities to either co-host with them or simply attend their event, and work with them to figure out ways to capitalize on times when folks are already gathering. Opening up conversations by asking about those community needs and goals broadly, and then beginning to look for those intersections and narrow back in to say, you know, here's the project goals that we have, here are the resources we think can be brought to the table, and look for those win-win opportunities where we could improve quality of life and really meet those needs that are already known to the community and defined by them. Avoiding technical jargon, we talked about that a little bit on the last slide, just making the conversations accessible and welcoming. It's really easy for communities to feel when they come into a space where a lot of technical language is being used, that they don't belong, and that their contributions would not be welcome or received well. So making sure that we avoid those moments. And then finally, consider arranging a community tour. We've talked a lot and emphasized understanding community needs and goals. A tour is a really great way to do that. And so whether you're doing it in person when there's not a pandemic, or whether you're doing it in multiple cars with everybody on a conference call while there is a pandemic, it's just a great way to really ground yourself and see at the street level what the community challenges are. It's also a great way to build relationships. You know, when you're walking somewhere together, or driving right now, they're just things that come up that might not come up when you're on a Zoom call, you know, and all screened out and ready to go. So it's a really wonderful organic way to begin to build relationships and trust, as well as to ground yourself in the realities of that community. Next slide. Okay, so we want to come back to the project example that I shared earlier in Alameda County, the Voices for Vulnerable Populations. So in addition to the 3 focus groups that I mentioned earlier, which we co-hosted with community partners, there were some additional outreach methods that the community partners gave us advice about. And so I just want to talk a little bit about the 3 main opportunities we had for engagement. The focus groups were really the heart and soul of the project. We worked with each of the 3 community partners mentioned on the earlier slide to identify community-based locations and meeting times. We provided translation and interpretation services at meetings as requested. Some meetings were conducted entirely in the native language of that community. Other meetings were conducted simultaneously in English and Spanish. And then beyond the focus group conversations, the community partner that we were working with the day laborers had a suggestion that in addition to doing a meeting with folks in the day laborer community that they had really close relationships with and who they knew would come to a meeting, they said, you know, we also have folks in the day laborer community that we're actually still building trust with. And we go out and meet with them on the street corner as they're waiting to get picked up to go to work. And so would that be an opportunity to actually do a survey for folks who might not be ready or willing to come and sit down in more of a classroom space with us. And so we designed some simple in-person surveys that the partners themselves could conduct, recognizing that you know, they're still in trust building mode with some members of the community, and they saw that as a great way to not only continue building trust between their organization and the folks who are looking for work, but actually to begin to get information from them that might be different than from folks who already felt empowered to come to a focus group meeting. And then a third mechanism is that the community partner groups advised us that if we wanted to really kind of maximize our project budget and expand the reach as much as possible, it would be good to do an online survey of service providers. So the focus groups were a little bit resource intensive, and they were great because they led to these really deep dive conversations with specific vulnerable groups. But there were way more than 3 vulnerable groups that Alameda County wanted to gather information from and about. And so we decided to complement those 3 initial focus groups with an online survey of service providers to glean from those trusted community entities insights about how to best reach populations that they serve more broadly. And I'll just add an update that's not on the slide. The approach was really successful, and Alameda County was able to get a second round of grant funding to do additional focus groups this year. So they're continuing to build on this approach because they found it really helpful for understanding how to get this kind of really critical health and safety information to folks in the community in a timely way. Go to the next slide. All right, forming a public leadership group. So you've done your community meetings, you've done a lot of trust building. What's the next step? Some projects can benefit from a group of community residents who meet consistently over the course of the project, almost as a steering committee, and who are in relationship with each other and with the project team over the lifetime of the decision-making arc in the project. If you're going to do this, you want to make sure that you are putting together a diverse and representative group. One of the quickest ways to tank a public leadership group is if there's a significant portion of the population who feels they've been left out or are not represented. So you want to think about not only race and ethnicity, but also multi-generational choices with members on the group. Neighborhood longevity, especially for neighborhoods that are in the middle of change, making sure that you have folks who may represent generational families from the neighborhood, as well as newer families to the community. And then a mix of emerging and longtime leadership. Many communities have these trusted institutions, whether they're neighborhood associations or faith-based communities or community organizing groups, where there have been this long time history of leadership, but also looking to young people, thinking about who's that next generation of leaders and how can we create a space where those longtime leaders are mixing and even getting to mentor and learn from the emerging leaders in the community. So that kind of feeds into the next point about shared learning and co-creation. Just making sure that the space is one where dialogue is happening, where folks have the skills to understand positions versus interests and really listen to each other and look for those aha moments or those win-wins. Because we want to remember, right, that the community is not going to have one unified voice. And so it's important to build their skills for consensus building, for really listening deeply to each other, just as we want to be listening deeply to them. Allow the group to co-create their agendas with the project team. That's a really great way to make sure that the agendas are going in the right direction and that there's buy-in for the conversations that need to be had. Ask members of the group to be responsible for communicating and engaging with their respective communities. It's important that the leadership group not be viewed as an insular group of folks who have a special level of access and influence over project outcomes, but that they be viewed kind of as a connector between the local government that's leading the planning process and the residential community itself. Setting up a technical committee or resource partners to support the group. Elisa talked earlier about the importance of building relationships and access for leadership from communities, and this is a great way to do it. So they've got a contact list and folks that they've met in person who presented to them, who've sat through meetings with them, and are folks that they know they can reach out to if they have questions or ideas. And then finally, using equity supports. And we can go to the next slide. I've got some tips on how to use equity supports there. So equity supports is just what we at SKEO call this broad category of resources that you might want to think about including in your project budget, or approaches that you might use essentially to help lower barriers to participation. There's a lot going on in the world. Folks have a lot of responsibilities at work and at home and in their communities. And so if it is a community where lower community engagement is the norm, what are the barriers to engagement, and how can a project budget for and intentionally help address and overcome those barriers to increase participation? The first, and I think most central, is living wage compensation. And that can be a big deal for communities that have never budgeted for compensating folks for their participation before. But this is a really important way of honoring the wisdom and the expertise that community residents bring to the table. And so there are living wage calculators online. You can kind of go and look up one for your area if you want to get specific, or some communities like to reference $15 an hour as part of the Fight for 15 nationally, and use that as a marker. But thinking about what would be a target number of folks that you might want to engage, how are you going to be engaging them, and can you offer compensation? And we've done it in a variety of ways. Sometimes we do cash compensation. Sometimes we do gift cards. It really depends on what the community identifies as the right way to do compensation in their context. Other kinds of equity supports can include transportation reimbursements. Folks may live in communities where the buses are a primary mode of transportation, but they may only come every half an hour, or even in some cases an hour. And so it can be a big time investment to get to a public meeting. And if your budget can cover compensating folks to save their receipt from an Uber ride, that can be a really meaningful and pretty cheap way of helping overcome that barrier in terms of transportation. Childcare, making sure that you provide childcare at meetings, that can require a little bit of thought and vetting. You definitely want to provide a childcare provider who is licensed and insured, so that you're making sure it's a really safe and comfortable environment for parents or grandparents to leave their kids. Translation and interpretation. One great tip with this is not just to bring in an outside translator or interpreter, which is in and of itself helpful, but actually to work with the community to ask, is there anyone inside the community who has these skills and would be willing to partner with us in this work, and then obviously compensating that person. So you're making sure that you're thinking through all aspects of your budget and how you're funneling those resources back into the community with every action that you take. The next one is meeting at a community selected location, and that can have to do with increasing access in terms of geographic proximity, and again, funneling those resources back and compensating the institution that's hosting the meeting for their meeting space. And then meals. Nobody wants to facilitate a meeting while folks are hangry. And so, thinking about a lot of meetings, we tend to provide snacks. Are we providing actually healthy food for folks at meetings? Are we providing food that is culturally relevant to that community? And then ultimately, can we purchase that food from a locally owned business? Next slide.
Yeah, Sarah, I just wanted to jump in here for a second. You mentioned budget a couple of times, and I'm I'm curious, I'm sure some folks are maybe hearing this and thinking, maybe working on projects that already have a really tight budget. And so trying to think about these different strategies within a confined project budget. And I just sort of want to lift up our role as planners to really, we have, I think, a unique role in sort of advocating either with our client, that these are important for a successful project. Because if you don't do this part well and you come up with a plan that then the community is not for, and maybe it goes up for, again, in front of like the board or city council and doesn't get approved because it doesn't have community support, that also has budget implications. So I just wanted to underscore that, we as planners have, I think, a unique role in sort of advocating for these pieces as part of planning budgets.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that, Elisa. And the other thing is that it doesn't have to be that expensive. I think it can feel like a big barrier, or it can feel scary to say, let's think about compensating community residents for their time. But there are ways to build in expectations about what the compensation would look like, who would get compensated, what is an activity for which they would get compensated, where you can have a sense and begin to budget out pretty confidently what that expense would look like.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for example, for the Alameda project, I think that the equity supports probably all told came in around $2,500. It was not a huge part of the budget, but it was a very meaningful part of the budget. And when folks at our meetings found out that they were going to be compensated, there was, at one meeting in particular, there was a palpable level of emotion in the room around, this is the first time that anyone's ever told me that my opinion, that my experience, that the lived wisdom that I have is that valuable that you'd want to pay me for my time. And so it's really meaningful, even if $15 an hour doesn't seem like much. In the big picture, it can have not only a financial impact, but an emotional and trust building impact in that community.
Exactly.
Okay, so we'll just do one more case study. We worked a couple of years ago with the District Department of Energy and the Environment in Washington, D.C. To form an equity advisory group. So this is the name that they selected for their public leadership group. And the goal was to pull together a representative group of residents from the far northeast Ward 7 to help inform recommendations that would guide DC's actions on climate change. DC already had a climate change plan in place, and so now they were thinking about implementation, where to put budgetary resources, and which actions to prioritize in which communities. And one of the realizations that they had was that they really were going to need some extra experience and expertise coming directly out of the far northeast Ward 7 community, because it was an underserved community, predominantly African American, predominantly low income, and so they were looking for advice about how to come in and do the strategies in a way that would be beneficial. The EIG met for about 6 months in their initial formation and recommendations development process. SKEO did neutral facilitation, which was really important because the community didn't really have a positive relationship with the District Department of Energy and the Environment. And so it was an opportunity to have a neutral person in the room to help facilitate those dialogues between residents and staff. We also did a lot of capacity building, giving the community residents the skills and tools to understand the existing climate action plan. And then also on the agency side, doing some trainings to help the agency staff actually understand the history of the community. We did a timelining exercise where members of the community took a piece of butcher paper, put it up on the wall, and created this really elaborate and rich timeline of the history of their community. And it was a huge learning experience for members of staff who tended to be newer to the DC area than many of the folks represented on the committee whose families have been in this community for generations. So over that 6-month period, they developed recommendations that the DOEE was able to adopt. And at the end of the process, the EAG was asked, would you like to continue to meet? We had a specific process that was funded. Residents were being compensated for their participation in the group through that 6 months. But the project was ending, and so the question was, did they see a value in continuing to meet? And in fact, they did. They continued to meet to this day. 2 years later, they have reformed under a new name and are continuing to partner with the DOEE to work on implementation of resilience hubs in their communities, which will be intended to provide resources during times of natural disaster or stress due to heat waves in the summer. And then the final outcome, in addition to the EAG, the DOEE not only got recommendations on how to specifically implement their climate change initiatives, but also were able to produce a guide to community-centered engagement as a model for other departments across the city government, and in fact have made that available more broadly. So that's a resource that you all may want to look up, and they've done a fantastic job of capturing what the process looked like, what worked well, and how community-centered engagement can actually advance equity and positive outcomes for the city as a whole, in addition to the specific community that those residents are coming from. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so just quick recap. The IAP2 spectrum of public participation, use it, use it, use it, and really think about the life cycle of your project so that you are being specific about what outcomes participants can influence at every stage. Allow your relationship building efforts to inform equity approaches in regards to communication, outreach, and partnerships. Honor the time, wisdom, and expertise of participants by providing compensation and other equity supports. And build co-creation into the process. Center those community preferences and cultural considerations in the outcomes. Next slide.
Great. So I will pick it up here, Sarah, as we start to wrap up and start to get into opportunity to hear from you all through what questions you might have. And so we're actually going to launch another poll question. So that'll come up in just a second. But we'd love to hear from you if sort of in reflecting in your own professional work, are there projects where you could elevate underserved voices to strengthen the outcomes and advanced equity? Give folks just a minute, yes or no. Okay, it looks like a majority of folks responded with an overwhelming yes, that there are projects that you all are working on where you could elevate underserved voices. That's great. And I think related to that, we wanted to wrap up and just share a series of questions that can help you explore what approaches could really support that deeper and more meaningful engagement to advance equity. So I'll go ahead and I can resume sharing my screen just to walk through a series of questions that you can ask yourself to apply to your own work. So as soon as we hide the poll results, I think I should be able to share my screen again.
See if that works. It was getting stuck.
Yes, thank you.
Perfect.
I know one of the things we talk about with now virtual engagement is to embrace glitches, and because we've all been there, but that was a very minor one, so thank you. So again, these are just a series of questions for you all to consider as you are thinking about connecting with underserved communities in your planning projects. So a range of questions here, not meant to be prescriptive, but help to prompt some ideas for you for your own project. So the first one is, again, what do you know about community issues, goals, and needs? What would you like to learn more about? What disparities are present in the community? Again, these types of questions can really also help you identify the elephant in the room. What are the key stages throughout the life cycle of your project? What level of influence could participants have over outcomes at each stage? Again, this is where that IEP2 diagram can help you with these questions. And what opportunities for co-creation exist at each stage of the project? And I think it's important to think about this sort of co-creation or opportunities for co-creation as really a spectrum. Everything from working with the community to identify the best meeting time location, all the way to really in empowering the community or your public leadership group to either co-author the plan or supporting them in facilitating the meetings. Who can you contact to start building relationships and partnerships with trusted community leaders and institutions? Next, what opportunities can you envision to work with community partners on modes of communication and meeting logistics that are familiar and comfortable for the community? And what equity approaches to communication and outreach might be important for this community? Sarah gave a lot of really great examples related to that question. The next set of questions here related to this are, could there be an opportunity to co-host meetings with a local agency or organization that has programs and services within the community? Another question you can ask yourself is, can you envision participating in a community-led tour to understand community challenges and build partnerships? And this may also be sort of helping community with the logistics to help make that happen, but really sort of creating the opportunity for community members to really lead that tour. And most often we find people really take pride in where they live and sharing their stories and their experiences. And as Sarah mentioned, this is such a great way to build trust. Is your project a good fit for a public leadership group? And then what equity supports might be essential to equitable community engagement for this community? Again, Sarah listed a lot of different types of that type of support. And then finally, how might your design approach center community preferences and culture? So again, those are just a series of questions for you to consider as you are looking to build deeper and more meaningful engagement in your planning projects, and particularly looking for those opportunities to connect with underserved communities within your design process. So I think with that, Sarah and I would first just want to say thank you for your time, and really look forward to the questions that have come in throughout the presentation.
Okay, great. Let's first kind of go over some of the folks from the polling question about barriers. We did get some folks typing some questions in, or some comments in. The first one is, and folks also type your questions in that chat box if you have them, and we can see if we can get to them. So some of the other barriers: lack of access to computers or having contact info for them. Lack of respect or appreciation for a particular culture. Let's see, what else do we have? Having access to translators or outreach to communities that do not speak English as a primary language. So these are some more. Do you have any comments about those folks that type those in?
Yeah, Sarah, let's start with the top with computer access and sort of the digital divide.
Yeah, I'd be curious about your thoughts on this one, Elisa. I know in many communities that I've worked in, that digital divide is really is real, and sometimes it's a generational divide in addition to an income divide relative to technology. One thing that I feel like we've learned is that in many communities where the digital divide exists, young people at least still have access to smartphones. That tends to be more common than you might initially think. And so looking at ways that you can design, if you're doing online engagement, designing it to work on a smartphone interface can be helpful. Elisa, is there anything you would add to that?
Yeah, I think also, you know, when we think about as we start a project and we develop our community engagement plan, which is really meant to, you know, you adapt throughout the process as you learn more by working with those your trusted community leaders on what would work best. I think one of the things that has worked well is providing multiple ways for people to be able to participate. So if you're doing an online survey, you also do a paper version of the survey, and building, a lot of times building relationships with the local churches in the area that you're working with is a great way to reach people, and again, just providing different ways of providing the same information in different venues. I know we've particularly here during the pandemic where everything went virtual, you know, we did these recorded presentations, and so we could do virtual town halls, but then we also shared that with the local TV network, so it could be broadcast right into people's homes, or sharing it or taking advantage of people's sort of digital literacy going up during the pandemic, with, you know, people attending church on Zoom, and, you know, really trying to just get creative in ways of trying to meet folks where they already are sort of congregating, if you will.
Yeah, redundancy. Build in a lot of redundancy.
Yes.
You will benefit from it.
Let's see. I missed the second one. I was looking for the second.
Sure.
I have access to translators, but what was the second one?
Well, let's see here. Lack of respect or appreciation for culture. Was that it? I think that might have been the other one. And then translators, outreach to communities that don't speak English as a primary language.
That's such an interesting, I love the way that was phrased, lack of respect for cultures. I think it can be easy to overlook that planning, the field of the profession of planning has a culture, and that even that culture operates within a broader framework of white culture, typically, in our institutions. And there have been a lot of great thought pieces done online this year about what is white culture, what does that mean for institutions, what are the values of white culture. I know a lot of times as white people we haven't necessarily thought that through because it's so easy for us. It's pretty intuitive to move through the world that was in the way that was meant for us. But that can lead us to overlook the strengths, the beauty, the wisdom that comes out of cultures that may not be the dominant culture in the US. And it can also cause us to maybe overlook sometimes really simple ways of connecting in meaningful ways. And I think that's where going back to those community institutions who know the culture of the community that you're trying to reach, and who can give you that insight about how to translate what your goals are into a framework that's meaningful to that community, that really elevates the strengths that community brings to the planning process is really important. So knowing where your blind spots are and not being uncomfortable about them, but just saying, you know, here it is. I'd love to learn more. Tell us how we can do a good job.
Yeah, which goes back to that sort of asking for feedback. And even from simple things of like designing like the outreach flyer, like having your community partners review that just for a language check has been really helpful to make sure your language is inclusive and accessible. So access to translators. Sarah, I love your point there about to the extent possible, looking locally for those translation services. And sometimes it's the younger people within the community that are actually really experienced and adept at, you know, translating for maybe their older family members. Have you had any other experiences of with the accessing translators and building those into the project to share?
Yeah, sometimes community partners will already have someone who can do it, and then certainly young people, and I think just emphasizing compensation. And I think especially if there is a young person put forward, giving them that vision that this is a skill that they have that's worthy of compensation, and that brings a lot and is essential to communication in daily life. So yeah, just compensate your folks and ask those community partners, is there someone who has that skill in this community? And you know, you can ask the question also, is there any reason we would want to have a certified translator or interpreter? You know, there is a difference between someone who does it professionally and someone who does it in their daily life. And so thinking about you know, what skills does that person have to deal with some of the language that we may be using in the planning process, and if this isn't a professional area that they're used to translating in, making sure that they understand up front and have a chance to review the materials and get comfortable with the likely topics and words and phrases that are going to come up in English, can help them think ahead about how to, in real time, keep the conversation going in a second language.
Excellent.
And kind of speaking of compensation, we had one of our attendees comment, it is important we compensate the participants and provide childcare. Not only do they need to, or not only are they giving up their time, but it also shows we value their opinion and input. So I thought that was well stated.
Yes.
Next question. This is interesting. Have you seen an example where a local government is willing to hand over the final decision to the community?
At different phases of the project, I would say, like in the public leadership group example, in the park planning project that I mentioned that was in Raleigh, North Carolina, the public leadership group in their capacity had the decision-making power to create this updated master plan for the park. And so it was very clear where their decision-making sort of at which part of the process they had, you know, decision-making. But it was a consensus-based approach as well. So it really, you know, put the emphasis on them to really have to work together to come up with a consensus-based master plan to then present to City Council. And then when the project transitioned from master plan into construction, the public leadership group then their role changed to advisors, from decision makers, empowered decision makers, to advisors, because at that point it pivoted to sort of more of a you know, construction, and so navigating that transition and being very upfront of how they would still be engaged in the process and valued as experts, having developed the master plan, and making sure that their input was continued throughout implementation and construction, but also being clear about the change in the role there. Sarah, do you want to? Is there something that comes to your mind?
Yeah, well, beyond so we shared a number of examples about public leadership groups and giving folks, the communities, the opportunity to develop their own plans and recommendations to cities. You can also think broadly about the trend towards participatory budgeting in city budgets, where a portion of the budget is reserved for community groups to decide what they want to do with. There are a lot of case studies. If you just Google participatory budgeting, or you can look up and see what different communities are doing now with different approaches they're taking, and the creative projects that come out of that kind of work that you know, quite frankly, would never come out of a consulting firm like ours, or probably from city staff. You know, it's just a different mindset when you live in a community and you know the ins and outs, and can really come up with are empowered to use that budget in a way that really speaks to very, very specific needs you see on a day-to-day basis.
Great. Next one. So how do you organize in smaller rural communities where resources in general are scarce and community leaders wear a lot of hats and may not have time to add another one to their wardrobe? That's good.
I love that.
Yeah, right? I like that.
Yeah.
Great question. Yeah, Sarah,
yeah. I can just, I mean, start out by saying, you know, this happens in so many communities, and I think it's good to highlight rural ones in particular, but it's not limited. That problem is not limited to rural communities, but thinking about, what are those hats that your trusted community leaders are already wearing, and how can the work that you're trying to do fit in to the roles they're already playing? So you're really maximizing the time that they're already putting in. I think it's just really important to look for those alignments and to be willing to shape your project process around those alignments. So, for example, if a community has a couple of times a year where they gather, like a harvest festival, these predictable moments in the cyclical year of a community where we get together, we spend time together, we celebrate each other. Those are great times and places to kind of think, okay, how can we align either information gathering or dialogue with the community or presenting back to the community with those moments, so that there's not an extra layer of effort happening on the community organizing end.
Exactly. Yeah, I was just going to emphasize just really connecting your project with their goals, so that they, I think that's really helpful in terms of also valuing people's time, and then and connecting to existing initiatives or events. So spot on, Sarah.
And make as much for them as you can. We had worked with a lot of community organizations who have regular modes of communicating, and if you can just give them content, they can push it out. But it's you providing, whether it's that Twitter message or content for an email or content that fits a newsletter, and making sure you understand what's that mode of communication that they already used, and how do you write content that fits the space they have available, right? And a little newsletter article is very different than what content you provide for a tweet or a Facebook post. And so knowing ahead of time what mode of communication they use, and just make it super, super easy. So all they have to do is copy and paste.
Next question. And if you're hearing strange sounds, it's my 9-week-old eating. He's a really loud eater, so I apologize. Have you ever facilitated an ambassador program? So the person asking this question says, I have trained youth who then do outreach engagement, documents, and receive community service hours, which is required by the local school district. I've also trained adults as ambassadors as well. Thoughts on that? Have you used that as a method? Does it work? What are the drawbacks, the positives?
Yeah, I would say that we have in projects in sort of different ways have focused on capacity building, to whether it's as in this example with outreach, to conducting like in-person surveys, or even just like facilitation training, so that community members can then sort of help design the agenda for a meeting and facilitate the meeting. I think that gets back to really sort of empowering communities as part of in sort of shaping the future of their community. Sarah, are there any examples that you want to share?
Yeah, I think we did a project in Rocky Mount where they were in the process of developing a community ambassador program, very much as the commenter described. Our project did not create that program. It was being created in parallel at the same time that we were doing a very large visioning multi-county project to develop a cohesive identity and vision for the region around the city of Rocky Mount. And so those folks were part of the process, and as we were forming that group of folks, they were telling them about, here's this visioning process that's coming up. Here are some specific opportunities for you to participate within that process, and here are some ways in which we're going to be bringing that process into our program. So really letting folks know, if your time and energy needs to go to the Community Ambassadors program, here are the elements we're going to be bringing right into the program. And if you have additional time and energy and want to get more fully involved with with the planning project itself, here are ways to do that.
I'm getting several questions from folks just wanting to know more on how to navigate all of this through COVID. You touched on it a couple times, but I think folks want to know, the show must go on, right? And we still need to plan, we still need to communicate, we still need to, be inclusive. So how do we do it? How do we do it when we're living in this virtual world? And folks who might normally go to a library to access their digital world can't even do that now because a lot of libraries are closed down. The logistics are sort of out of control at this point. So how do you do it safely?
Yeah, great questions. And I feel we've all had to adapt pretty quickly here in the last year. That could probably be a session in and of itself of like what's worked well and what hasn't. I think I just want to underscore the sort of redundancy again of sort of outreach approaches. I feel like we've even done more redundancy than we were doing prior to the pandemic, and really looking at where are folks already gathering safely in person, and can we are those the moments that make sense to reach people, and then also like what's critical right now, because also thinking about community health and safety, and particularly in underserved or under-resourced communities that may be more like heavily impacted or burdened during the this health crisis, and I think just being aware of that going into it. But I know for some of the we were doing Hurricane Michael recovery work in Florida, and had all these workshops planned for the summer, and all of that had to go online, and we had to keep our timeline because the funding we had a timeline for when the funding wrapped up, and so we printed like large posters of the design concepts and put those where folks were already going, like at the grocery store, City Hall to pay their utility bill through the drive-through window. So really just trying to get to know, working with our community partners there, where are those places that people are going safely, and taking advantage of outdoor opportunities to the extent possible. Sarah, do you have other examples or?
Yeah, well, I think just maybe going back to the equity support idea, one way that we have found to adapt equity supports under COVID is that, a lot of things like childcare, if you're not meeting in person, those things that you may have budgeted for around equity supports may no longer be relevant. And so, again, just going back to the principle of putting money back in the hands of the community and making sure that folks who are giving their time are empowered to overcome those barriers in the way that makes most sense to them. So we've had communities who have asked us to, because we can't do cash, again, if we're not in person. Cash is often preferred, but that's difficult to do if you're not going to see somebody to hand it off. So some communities have said, well, hey, what about an Uber Eats gift card? That allows our community members to take advantage of contactless drop-off, which is, a need right now. And other communities have said, well, what if, since we're not, having a big meeting and doing childcare, can we take the money we would have spent on that and actually increase the amount of the stipend? So maybe we're using Visa gift cards, and instead of $15 an hour for an hour-and-a-half meeting, maybe now we're looking at $50 as a stipend amount for that meeting, so that folks can choose to use those resources in the way that makes the most sense to them. And so that we're, again, just recognizing all the stressors that communities are under, especially as folks struggle to work in safe ways, and maybe underemployed or unemployed as a result of the pandemic. How can we get that money back out of our project budgets and to them in ways that meet our project goals, but are responsible and compassionate, and trusting that community members know how to meet their own needs best.
I think also just being mindful of people's time too. I think I've gotten being more thoughtful about how can I design a meeting to be more efficient in the time. And so just so knowing that folks are have a lot going on more so now, or maybe feeling sort of Zoom fatigued if it is sort of a virtual event. So just looking for maximizing efficiency as well. And again, not relying on one way, even in a virtual meeting, recognizing that some people may just call in, and are you providing a toll-free number for them if it is a phone call, and sending the materials that you may be sharing via desktop share, sending those to them, even if it means mailing them copies prior to the meeting. So I think, yeah, again, just going back to really the redundancy and sort of thinking through all those ways that you can reach people, and making the effort to do that.
Okay, I think it's time to wrap up. We've had so much fun. Folks, don't forget, we are recording the session. It will be available on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast Series on YouTube and we'll pop up. And we'll also have a PDF copy of the slide deck. It is up right now on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. So thanks to you, Sarah and Elisa, for joining us today. This was fun. It was great. It's an important topic. We hope to hear from you again. Folks, feel free to reach out to our two panelists today if you have any other questions that we didn't get to on our long list here. So folks, thanks for joining us today. Don't forget to log those CM credits, and everyone stay safe, and we'll talk next time.
Great, thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone.